How did we go from this to this? I'm Tiffany of Stitchin and I bring historical fashion to life so that you can live out your literary dreams. Since 2020, I've been making clothes inspired by what the marches would have worn in Little Women. And today, we are exploring the political influences on what the March sisters wore. Ayana of the Vintage Guidebook has kindly joined me today and is here to share her expertise on fashion history with us.
Thanks for having me, Tiffany.
As always, it's always a pleasure to have you.
So I'm Ayana, aka the Vintage Guidebook. I'm currently a history student and also a lover of all things related to fashion history. So this is perfect for me.
We're super excited to be exploring Victorian fashion, specifically during Louisa May Alcott's lifetime in this video, as well as two upcoming videos, and how her family, with many others of the period, used clothing as a form of protest. So let's talk for a second about the Victorian fashion period. This is a very long era because Queen Victoria ruled for 63 years. Louisa May Alcott was born just before the Victorian era began on November 29th, 1832. She was the second daughter of Bronson and Abigail Alcott, and she was born in Germantown, Pennsylvania. Queen Victoria rose to the throne in 1837. And during both Louisa May Alcott's and Victoria's lifetime, there was a host of political events that influenced the fashion that they wore. First up was the British abolishing slavery in 1838. And then next, we had the first women's rights convention in the United States, hosted in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. A lot of agitation for rights was going on throughout this time period. And believe it or not, the women's rights movement actually grew out of the temperance movement, which we'll talk about later, how those two were connected. In 1853, the United Kingdom was involved in the Crimean War. This influenced some of the fashions that Queen Victoria wore. And then in 1858, the Government of India Bill was passed in the United Kingdom. We think this probably is connected to the fact that slavery was abolished, and so now the United Kingdom is relying more heavily on India for resources, labor, and other things. This established the crown as the ruler of India after the Indian Rebellion in 1857. Over here in the United States, Abraham Lincoln becomes the US president in 1861, and the American Civil War starts almost immediately after. Of course, this is a long, bloody conflict that lasts for 4 years, including the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the war ending in earlier 1865, and then the 13th Amendment ratified at the end of 1865. This 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States. In 1868, a few years later, Louisa May Alcott publishes Little Women. This was not her first book to be published. This was not the first thing she ever wrote, but this is what she gained her success from. In 1871, we see fashion start to change and a new era begins. Do you want to say that for me, Ayana, because I am terrible at pronouncing French?
Yes, a new era called La Belle Époque in 1871.
Yes, and that is French for the beautiful era. It began after the Franco-Prussian War ended and continued actually until World War I began. So it was an era of opulent fashions, and we will talk a little bit more about that later as well. In 1881, in the United Kingdom, the Rational Dress Society was founded. This built off of some earlier movements to try to change women's dress so that it was more practical and comfortable. And then sadly, a few years later, in 1888, Louisa May Alcott passed away at only 55 years of age. And so we're going to kind of stop in 1888 where Louisa May Alcott passes away, and I will leave the fashion period after that for future videos. While the differences between Regency and Victorian fashion are quite drastic, They were not heralded with the violent measures that brought in Regency fashion. However, they were marked with the changing of a monarch and the ideals of women that accompanied it. So this new idea of women being just dainty and picturesque and even ornamental, you see that a lot when you do research, is the Victorian women were basically just ornaments, is coming into play. And so, of course, the dress has to follow suit. All right. So let's talk for a minute about what those dresses actually were like. Instead of having the high bodice like we saw in the Regency era, you start to see more waisted dresses. Okay. And in the early Victorian period, these dresses were one piece. You had a bodice and a skirt joined together, and the bodice was very closely fitting. Had a long whalebone corset and usually additional boning inside of the bodice itself. The bodice usually fastened at the back, requiring a maid to help you get dressed properly many times. And then an extremely full skirt. This helped emphasize your waist and make your waist appear smaller because the skirt was so full.
Can we talk a little bit about how different that is from the Regency era, where everything is just long and flowy and it was relatively easier to dress yourself, and then going into this era where everything is closely fitted, you definitely need someone else. I mean, people back then didn't live alone the way we do now anyway, but still, it's such a difference. It's almost night and day.
Yeah, it really is. And if you look at the fact that the Regency period was all about trying to get rid of all of those undergarments and all of that structure, right? And basing it on the shift or the bottom layer. And then now you go into the Victorian era and everything is all about structure and all the extra layers that you're starting to add on underneath, which we'll talk about more later. But there's different estimates of the amount of pounds that the underwear of the period weighed, and some of those are around like 14 pounds just of the undergarments you were wearing. That does not include your dress, your shoes, your hat, your jewelry, any of those things. So, yes, completely, totally different view, right, than what was going on during the Regency era. Along with this, you have a huge influx of etiquette manuals. They began to be published in the 1830s and they were published at an astounding rate. I don't know the exact number of how many were published, but if you go to Google and you search etiquette manuals, Victorian etiquette manuals, you can find them for almost every year throughout the Victorian period for both the United States and the United Kingdom. And it's almost kind of like a reaction of let's put order back into our society, right? We had this revolutionary era, and all these people were pushing the limits and trying to change things, and now we need order back into our society. And so these etiquette manuals educated women on every single thing they were supposed to do: how to dress, how when you paid calls, how to entertain people, how to dress for mourning, how many days you were supposed to wear, full mourning, and just so many different instructions for every single thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Tiffany. Like the way that the Victorians were almost obsessed with order, I think is definitely a response from the Regency, right? Where you have chaos of different wars, you have chaos of different rulers, right? Regency literally means someone else was ruling in place of the monarch that we already have, but don't worry about him because he's not really part of it. It just seems like they seem to feel that was way too much chaos. Let's get things organized to an extreme, right? Like every little bit of life had to be regimented, and this is how you do it. If for some reason can't fall in line, we're going to make sure that you know how. Like they were definitely very concerned about this.
Yes, they were. They really were. And along with that, it was very much like we're going to establish men are men and women are women. And this was seen very, very strongly through dress, right? So the men's suit that started to come into play during the Regency era that we talked about in our last Fashion is Political video is still becoming kind of like the great equalizer for men. It's a very practical dress. On the other hand, women are becoming this ornamental thing, like we talked about earlier. And this kind of ties to what you see in Little Women when Meg goes to Sally's house and Sally dresses her up basically like a China doll, right? She puts her in that blue silk and puts on the earrings and all these different things to make her look absolutely charming and decorative. And this was also because women didn't really have a lot of options outside of marriage or very low level labor, and which did not pay. It was very difficult to live on. It was very hard on your body. And so women were, of course, first and foremost going for the marriage. Then, of course, once a woman became married, the more ornamental you were, the more idle you were, the better it looked for your man of the house, right? They're providing well for you. And so it's speaking well of them if you can dress very fancy.
Yeah, a lot of signaling, like we talked about in our Regency video, right? If the white loose garments signaled, "Hey, I have time and or money to have someone else launder this," then the flip side of Victorian dress is the more delicate, the more tight fitting, the more restrictive the clothing was, showed, well, my man, right? Some man, your husband, your father, your brother, somebody can afford to keep me looking like this, where I don't have to be doing any labor because obviously this dress is not something that can get dirty. It's not something I can move around in, but that's okay because I don't need to. He makes enough that I don't have to worry about anything. I can sit around all day and just look like this and not be expected to do
Right.
anything else.
Yeah. And it kind of puts into context like what we see with the March sisters again, right? Because you've got Meg and Amy very determined to marry. Amy especially wants to marry well. Meg gets her dream. It
Yeah.
doesn't actually come true, but Amy does make that dream come true. And then of course on the other end of the spectrum you have Joe who's like, "No, I'm going to make my own way. I'm going to find a way to exist on the labor of my own brain and my own hands." I mean, Louisa May Alcott herself was very much like that in real life as well. She was one of the, I would say, relative few who was able to make it through writing and actually make a good living from it. Most women were entering the workforce through factories, through domestic service, some through agriculture, and they didn't have a lot of options and they didn't have the advantages or the talent to become a writer like Louisa May Alcott.
Yes, I think that's a really great point of some women either didn't want to or couldn't get married. And so they had to make their own way, but there were so few options available to them. Let's say she did try that, just like Joe March and a few others. What would that have looked like? How would she have been viewed by this society that was very rigid and imposing its morals?
Oh, yes, there's definitely a lot of ostracization that went with that as well. And we're going to talk about that more later. Like, even women that did things like work in agriculture because they didn't really have any other option, right? Their family needed them to work in agriculture. They were looked down upon because they were considered to have a strong mind and a strong body. And oh my goodness, women were not supposed to have that during that period, apparently. And I also want to say if you want more of Ayana's fashion information, fashion history, you need to follow her at Vintage Guidebook on all the things, right?
Yeah, that is my handle everywhere on social media.
So she definitely puts out some very great information on all things to do with fashion and history. So let's talk about how the monarchy kind of influenced some of these changes. So we know that King George III and Queen Charlotte had a lot of children. They had 15 and 13 of them reached adulthood. However, when George III was nearing the end of his life, there were no legitimate heirs. Which says a lot about like the Regency era and the quote unquote loose morals that were a part of that era, which I always find an interesting fact to bring up because people think, they lump it all together, right? People will call Regency fashion Victorian. They also think that like the values that were part of the Victorian era were part of the Regency era, and that is not true at all, right? The Regency era was about revolution and about making changes.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting. People do have this idea that the further back you go, the more rigid morals were, or the maybe not morals, but the that thinking. Not at all. It is not true that the further back you go, the more restrictive it is. It kind of ebbs and flows. It's a roller coaster. Some periods are very strict with what you are supposed to be doing. Some periods were much looser.
Right.
And yeah, this one is definitely a tough one. And like with so many heirs or so many potential heirs, sorry. And non-viable by the time we get to the king's death. Like, that's very interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then we
Yeah.
have a race. His sons are like, okay, we're in a race to produce a legitimate heir. His son Edward married Victoria, and that marriage occurred in 1818. The next year, they had a daughter who became Queen Victoria. And with the rise of Queen Victoria, there was this appearance, at least, we know that this is not actually true if you do the research, but of stricter morals and family values, and like we mentioned earlier, just more structure in general to society, right? We talked about moving from the less structured garments with less undergarments to the more structured garments with more undergarments. That's just one example of the way that her monarchy influenced this idea.
Yes, even though we had all of this chaos and revolutions and shuffling around of monarchs during the Regency era, clothing still stays the same, right? This was still a projection of status, of wealth, of power. The role of clothing has not changed, but the way that it shows that gets changed a little bit, right? We said now clothing moves into close fitting for women instead of loose. It moves into darker instead of more colorful for men. The fabric becomes finer instead of thicker fabrics. We start getting into a lot of that sportswear we talked about in the Regency to sort of reflect the military look. All that's gone in the Victorian age. We're trying to differentiate ourselves from the poor by showing our clothing isn't military inspired. It's not clothing of action. It is definitely clothing of idleness and leisure.
And they use this to distinguish a lot of different social classes and also people of different races were not supposed to dress in the nicest stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. The sort of flip side with the anecdote you shared about Meg March being all dressed up like this beautiful China doll when she goes to Sally's party, and how that serves to denigrate her. I remember in the book, Marmee kind of, tis at her saying,
Yeah.
"You're more than that, Meg." Like, but yeah, for example, Black people who dressed above their station, as it was referred to by the Black codes, I am originally from Louisiana, so I will reference the Louisiana version, the Code Noir. Both did the same thing by saying, you know what? Actually, if you're Black, whether you were free or enslaved, these codes govern Black life. You're not allowed to wear this. You're not allowed to wear that. And so, what are they not allowed to wear? Mostly the things that will make you look very beautiful and look like you live a life of leisure and look like a China doll. So, there's very much a flip side there to white women refusing to be infantilized in that way of looking like they can't do anything, and then Black people trying to access the clothing that makes them look like they don't do anything, because of course the stereotype for Black women is, well, of course she can do everything. She can do that hard manual labor. In fact, that's what she was born to do. There is nothing else we would value a Black woman for in society. So she doesn't need to look like she's idle. In fact, we don't want her to be, put her to work. So it's really interesting that you see that sort of flip side to Black women clamoring to access that look of idleness, that look of ornamentation, while white women are trying to rebuke it. This isn't just an impact of society, right? Although that is part of it. It's also because clothing could separate you and also offer safety in some cases. There are a lot of instances where people trying to free themselves will steal or barter or something, get themselves clothing that is above their station, and then pass as a free person, because that clothing that suggests idleness is signaling, oh, this person is not a manual worker. They can't
Yeah.
possibly be a slave. Look at their clothes. You couldn't go in the fields in that dress. So a lot of times they wouldn't even be stopped and asked for papers. They're just wearing the clothing of a free person. And so white people let them pass on by. I think that's a really funny story about how you could use clothing even if you didn't have, your free papers, even if you couldn't read or write. I love to think of all of these, enslaved people trying to find their way north or to other free territories and just kind of keeping their heads down with the nicest possible like dress or suit they can imagine and just hoping like, oh, no one stopped me, no one stopped me. But I love that clothing is the item that they use to gain that freedom. We always hear these stories about people secretly learning to read and write or, maybe begging the courts. Some people just stole a nice dress and hopped on a boat. So
You also had Mrs. Lincoln, and she was from the West, married to President Lincoln, and they, looked down on her because she was from the West, I guess, more of a pioneer background. They considered that she didn't know how to dress. She came from a more like working class background because they had to work the land and make their own way. And so she went $27,000 into debt to make sure she was well dressed during Lincoln's second campaign for presidency. And just to get an idea of how much money that is, that's almost $700,000 today. And because of his assassination and everything that happened after that, she was left with that debt. And so she paid a price, literally and figuratively, for being from a social background that wasn't as valued or wasn't looked as being, as much leisure, as being as high up the social order, all of those different things, right? And you see that too with the March sisters and like Meg thinking it's so important to wear a silk dress to Sally's party, or with Amy and her painting the old boots so that they matched her dress because I guess that was a status symbol as well, right?
the March sisters are a perfect example of that. Clothing plays such a big part in the Little Women book. All of the sisters view it so differently. Meg and Amy, I think, are the most relatable to a modern audience. And they definitely try to go for those nicer fabrics, that sort of new look of clothing representing a life of leisure. I think it's so interesting to see that compared with Jo and how she is not concerned at all with it, but she tries to make her own way. And then also tying that into the experiences of Black women during the same period who were clamoring to try to look that way and not being denigrated. They actually saw their status elevated when they tried to dress that way. Those of you watching, how do you think that our own clothing choices today are tied to social and political movements? That part hasn't changed. It was tied back then. It's still tied now. What do you think?
We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and we're going to continue analyzing political influences on Victorian fashion in future videos. So make sure that you subscribe and get notifications. And while you wait for that video to come out, watch my Becoming Jo March series to learn more about the Victorian fashions that the March sisters would have worn.